need.
Recording in progress.
We'll be starting in a couple minutes here. We're waiting for more people to join us. Okay, I think we will get started. I'm going to ask everybody if you would turn on your camera because we love seeing faces, and turn off your microphones. We don't like hearing voices. And I want to welcome you. Good morning. Welcome you to this community forum. I'm Dave Myers. I'm with the Berks Alliance, and the Berks Alliance hosts these forums generally on the third Thursday of the month. Sometimes we actually do more than that, and I'll talk about that when we get near the end. But we've been doing this for a period of time. I do want to thank those of you who responded to the survey that we sent out. We got some very, very positive results and some very good feedback, and some very good suggestions about topics that we might want to consider as we move forward. So more on that later. Today's community forum is going to focus on workforce realignment. It's about some interesting strategies for how do we secure, train, and employ the workforce, and dealing with issues of diversity and equity as we do that. Declining economic mobility is one of the defining chapters of our time. We know employers are facing challenges in recruiting and retaining workers. Some workers are finding it increasingly difficult to find good paying positions that use their skills and experience, but innovative and accountable workforce projects are delivering significant results for both workers and businesses. The Federal Reserve Banks in Philadelphia and Atlanta collaborated recently to produce a book providing case studies focusing on innovative ways to address workforce development and enhance economic mobility. Earlier this year, the Berks Alliance hosted a community forum with the Federal Reserve that focused on an innovative skills-based approach to occupational mobility. And that triggered some very interesting responses among people who participated in that program, looking at creative ways that social service agencies, educational institutions could rethink how they trained and recruited employees. And we're confident that this session will be equally valuable. Our primary speaker is Ashley Putnam, the Director of Economic Growth and Mobility Project for the Philadelphia Federal Reserve Bank. And she will share information on innovative projects across the country. Her work is focused primarily on both economic mobility and inclusivity, and is very intent upon bringing research to practice, something we need to do more of. She's going to be joined by Dan Fogarty, the Director and COO of the Workforce Development for Berks County, and Christy Gage Linderman, the Chair of the County Workforce Development Board. The Workforce Development Board has recently adopted a 4-year plan, and they're going to share elements of that plan and how it fits into things in Berks County. And I think we're going to find some interesting opportunities for overlap between the two presentations. I'm going to ask you to use the chat function with Zoom to submit your questions and comments. When we get done with the presenters, we'll go to the questions and comments. Hopefully we'll get all of them answered before we adjourn with our hard stop at 1 o'clock. But if not, we will share the questions and comments with the presenters and ask them to respond back to us, and we will share that with our audience. Also want to mention that we are recording this forum, and we will share that with everybody who registered for the event. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Ashley. You're on.
Great, thank you, Dave. And so happy to be here virtually with all of you. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to talk a little bit about what I do and the book that Dave mentioned and why this is such an important conversation for the moment we are in. So as Dave mentioned, I'm Ashley Putnam. I direct the Economic Growth and Mobility Project, which is a relatively new strategic initiative from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And we'll talk a little more about what that work is, what we've been focused on sort of more broadly, and the kind of background context for why we're concerned about that. And also kind of getting into some of those, like, what does this actually mean? How do we actually do this work? But before we get started, I do have to give my standard Federal Reserve disclaimer that the views expressed here today are mine alone and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So that being said, every time I give a presentation like this, often I'm asked the question, why does the Federal Reserve care about economic mobility? How is that part of our function in our work? And the answer is twofold. The first is that we do have our dual mandate, which is to maximize employment and ensure price stability. And as many of you know, because we are very often in the news and highlighted now, this is a really critical time for this work. And we're really concerned about that maximizing employment and what it means right now for workers, for employers, and for building more inclusive economies. So the Economic Growth and Mobility Project was launched really to kind of think about some of these issues. How do we make sure we are creating equal access to economic opportunity for all? And how do we make sure that we understand that that's essential for building more inclusive and resilient economies? So I focus on 3 general areas. I look at things like infrastructure, broadband access, transportation, housing. I look at workforce development, education, barriers to skill development, and we look at job creation. And we consider this part of our sort of recipe for inclusive economic growth. But for the sake of today's presentation, we're really focusing on that center pillar. And honestly, it could not be a more important time for this topic. And I think for many of you who do this work, it's not super surprising why. That being said, Dave mentioned this, and we're going to talk about this at the end. A lot of my work is really focused on how do we bring research to bear on actually advancing these goals, right? The Federal Reserve produces an incredible amount of research and knowledge, but it's oftentimes not localized and not able to actually be brought into kind of policy and action. And so the work I do, we do through what we call research and action labs, which are really, we consider them catalytic partnerships. So bringing people together in ways that really helps advance innovation, launch new pilots, and affect systems change. And so I'm going to end today's presentation talking about one such lab, which is mentioned in the book, and how we think about that in terms of affecting systems change, creating economic mobility. So let's start with where we are now. We're obviously in a critical moment for our economy. We have a lot of things happening that are impacting workers and the workforce. We have, prior to the pandemic, increasing income inequality. We had uncertainty about the future and jobs, automation and changes in work. And these are exacerbated by business closures and layoffs that took place as a result of the pandemic, not to mention funding shortages in governments as a result of all of these closures. And we see many ways in which this is impacting workers and the workforce system, and really our ability to reconnect people and help move up the economic ladder. We have several problems as we come into this, but one of the questions I'm often asked is really to think about who is at the other side of this, right? When we talk about inclusion and inequality, who are we talking about? Who is not being included and who was not included prior to the pandemic? So to give some context, the economy is recovering and we have seen, GDP increases, but many jobs are not coming back and many people who were already at risk are being left behind in recovery. And this is a major concern for us at the Fed, as well as for the work we do in the Economic Growth and Mobility Project. So first, we talk often about wage disparities. My colleague Paul Flora has just published a study that looks at where Black and Hispanic workers are generally in the economy. And we see they're often in generally low wage jobs, right? And that is true even before the pandemic. These disparities between Black households and white non-Hispanic households are fairly big. We also see job loss disparities. We look at who actually experienced unemployment and the unemployment rates, even in recovery. Black and Hispanic workers face 1.6 to 2 times the unemployment rate. At the same time, we're also seeing really specific impacts on women leaving the workforce, and particularly women who are mothers and mothers of young children. And this is, again, a concern because a good economy has a lot of workers in it, and we really want to make sure we are welcoming people into the workforce. We're also seeing concerns that are being replicated from previous recoveries. And there's some great research out there from some colleagues at the Fed, as well as some national researchers that show that Black and Hispanic workers, as well as women and those without college degrees, are often slower to regain employment and rebuild assets during recovery. And we're already starting to see some of those trends. So that's the problem. That's what brings us here today. Many of you know this problem. Many of you probably do this work and you work with job seekers and you work with communities and you are very aware of who has been left behind quickly and who is being left behind now. So the question is, what do we do? And why does it matter, right? Why is this conversation even important? Shouldn't we just go back to normal and everything will be better? So this focus we have at the Philly Fed right now has really been on how to build an equitable recovery for workers. And I'm going to define what that means for us. But the why is really about preventing some of these long-term dislocations, right? We see the workers who are impacted, and we know that those are workers who are already at risk. And if our recovery doesn't address some of these systemic inequalities, we're not going to see a more inclusive recovery. And we're going to see major disparities in regions, in neighborhoods, and in households in terms of who is able to bounce back from this. We also know from some incredible research that our colleagues at the San Francisco Fed did last year that there is an economic loss to gender and racial disparities. They estimate that our labor market is losing almost $2.6 trillion as a result of those disparities. So this isn't just a conversation about how do we help those who are being left behind. This is a conversation about how do we make sure our economy is doing the best it can for all of us? And how are we really leveraging those assets and those people who are not being included? So just so we have a little definition, what is the difference between recovery and equitable recovery? So I started my career in workforce development during the last downturn. And so sometimes I think a lot about like, what did we see then? And what are we really needing to focus on now? And so the first thing is, this kind of, well, we just need to go back to normal, right? If we go back to normal, unemployment will be reduced and everything will be fine. And that really is an assumption that assumes normal was working. And we know for a lot of us who work with communities who've been left behind that the economy wasn't working well for everyone. So how do we start to reimagine some of these systems and these patterns and these partnerships to create a new normal? We also often assume that if we can get someone a job, they will find a better one later. So just get that first job that you're able to right out of the recovery and you'll be able to move up. When we look back at some of our data, we see that that's not always the case for a lot of workers. And they often get stuck in these low wage jobs that are kind of churn and burn jobs without being able to really climb that economic ladder. And so a lot of today's conversation is about that. How do we invest in these pathways to build economic mobility? And finally, that when the economy recovers, all workers will be able to reconnect. And we know that there are things like childcare, broadband access, and other structural inequalities that make it difficult, even if you have the skills and the job is available. If you don't have transportation, if you don't have Wi-Fi, high-speed internet, those things are actually keeping you from being able to access them. And finally, what we're going to focus on today is that we have often treated this as individuals are responsible for their own training and skill development. And while that is something as a former HR person and recruiter that I hold very true and very important, we also have to think about some of these systemic gaps. so that even when you are responsible for your training and skill development, maybe there should be better partnerships and pathways so that people can really move up the ladder and we can help people navigate that. So for us at the Philly Fed, we have defined an equitable workforce recovery as these kind of 5 things. First is we have to acknowledge and examine the root causes of these employment disparities. We have to target interventions to people who are disproportionately impacted. We need to think about removing barriers to work, to training, to education. We need to encourage improved job quality as well as supports for workers, right? Those supports that you and I might need if we were to try to go and change to another job, all workers need those kinds of supports. And then really today, we're going to focus on those access to career pathways. How do we help people get to those pathways that lead to financial stability and really a financial security? So here's a couple things we can do. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some things I've worked on. So first, we focused a lot on reducing barriers, right? The digital divide is a really critical topic. I think it's something you guys will be hearing about later. My colleague Alvaro Sanchez has done some great research on broadband access and broadband internet, specifically in Pennsylvania, but also around the country. And we know that people are more likely to participate in the labor market when you have a computer. It's not crazy to think about. It's not rocket science. You and I are here participating in our jobs and learning, but you should think about what it even takes to apply to a job. You really are looking at most applications occurring online. And so you can think about how that digital divide really affects people, as well as access to quality and affordable childcare. We're also really interested in how we think about bias in hiring. We've done a lot of work, my colleague Keith Wardrop, on opportunity occupations, which are jobs that do not require a 4-year degree, but provide some of these pathways we're talking about. And one of the concerns is that there are critical talent pools being left behind because we often use the college degree as a barrier of entry. And there are so many people who could actually be very talented and very skilled in our labor market who are not getting that opportunity to get those skills and move up the economic ladder because they do not have that 4-year degree. So how do we rethink how we hire to make sure we're evaluating skills and not just credentials and degrees? And then finally, how do we foster these pathways to economic mobility? We know we need to shift resources. We know we need to think about career pathways differently. And we know we need to think not just about what someone does for that time being, but what they're able to do throughout the course of their career. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So on the fostering pathways, we have done some really interesting research. I mentioned before my colleague Keith and the work he has done on occupational mobility. And I'm going to plug a little tool that we have that's really interesting and I think very useful for all of you. But we've seen from that research that there is actually a high degree of similarity between some of the skills required in low wage work and some of the skills required in higher wage work. And when you think about some of the critical skills we ask for these days, they are things like communication, conflict management, ability to think critically, ability to work under pressure, right? And if any of you like me have worked in the service industry or in any sort of frontline job, you know that those kinds of jobs are building those skills. But there are also skills that are missing, right? And so one of the questions is, how do we upskill or reskill job seekers? And how do we make sure that employees are included in being able to connect from a low wage job to a higher wage job? And so one of the questions we've been asking is this a conversation just about a skills gap? Or is this a conversation about an opportunity gap? About who actually gets the chance to build those skills and connect to those jobs? And on that note, I'll plug the Occupational Mobility Explorer. Maybe I'll drop it in the chat here later. This is a really exciting tool that my colleagues have created that actually help people map some of those pathways that they can walk through. And so the example I have here is one of my favorites because we're talking about someone moving from a cashier to a customer service representative to eventually a human resources specialist, right? And we're looking at similarity in skills. We're also trying to identify what are the skills that are missing so that you can take those steps, right? And so that's a great tool just to kind of understand and look at what some of those skills are. But one of the questions remains, who pays for it? And this is really what I'm going to talk about today. When we talk about workforce development and workforce systems, we're often talking about systems with all sorts of confusing dollar amounts. So for any of you who are here, I know my colleague Dan is going to relate to this. Funding and workforce development kind of feels like this, right? Our current workforce development system is often transactional. We are providing a transaction fee or a fee for service. It is often uncoordinated. And so you have, certain dollars to help certain populations, certain dollars to help other populations, and they're not necessarily working with each other, if but for some of the amazing plans that folks like Dan put together. We often also pay for services delivered rather than outcomes. So for example, I will pay for you to teach a class, but I'm not necessarily paying for you to get the job that that class is supposed to be training you for. And then there's a low return on investment for both employers and economies, right? If you're not actually getting anything out of these training programs, we are putting money into systems that are not actually helping people achieve outcomes. That's bad for job seekers too. You imagine what it feels like if you go to a job training program and you spend your own money and resources and time to go through a training that doesn't connect to work. And so this is something that we've been really thinking about, is how do we rethink these systems and these funding systems so that we get to the future state we would like, where we are aligning with industry needs, where the funding is coordinated, where we're focused on outcomes and not outputs. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And where there's partnership, and I mean real partnership. And that's a little bit of what I'm going to talk about today, between employers, between the private sector and the public sector, and between agencies. And so that is actually what kind of led to some of the work we have been doing. So Dave mentioned this. Earlier this year, we released a book that I am really proud to have been a partner on. And that book is called Workforce Realignment: How New Partnerships Are Advancing Economic Mobility. This book is a labor of love that took almost 2 years to put together. We worked very closely with our colleagues at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, as well as our colleagues from Social Finance. And Social Finance is an organization that really looks at outcomes-based funding and innovative models. And so the book is it's available there at workforcerealigned.org. There's also a lot of other resources. There's a wonderful podcast I got to moderate. So if you're interested in podcasts, I got to talk to some pretty exciting guests there. But I want to kind of talk a little bit about what we learned from this book. And then I'm going to drill down on one particular pilot project that I was honored to be a part of, and I think might provide some lessons learned today. So the book really kind of examines not just like the theory of economic mobility or the theory of workforce funding, but actual concrete examples of innovative partnerships. And so we look at these partnerships that are often between government agencies and employers or training institutions, and think about what is that broader realignment we're looking for and how we prepare the future workforce. Some of the takeaways is that these partnerships really carefully balance incentives. So they make sure, for example, that a training institution has a stake in student outcomes. And they're not just thinking, okay, you're getting trained and you're good. We trained you. You know, we often joke this is the output is what they call butts and seats, right? How many people sat in the class and how many people are completing a certain number of hours is oftentimes how agencies get paid. And there are a lot of technical training institutions and other organizations that pay for someone to enroll in a class and sit in a class and complete hours, but aren't necessarily paying for the outcome, which is, did the student actually achieve the job? Did they stay in the job? Did they move up in the job, right? There's also a lot of thought about how do we make sure that we have pathways to scale some of these pilots? And how do we make sure we have programs that are effective and are going to work sustainably over time? The partnerships also link funding to results. Right? So the money that is being paid isn't, again, just for the service provided, it isn't transactional, but it's really thinking about how do we define success and advance and measure progress along the way. And that data sharing is actually hard, and it's one of the things we learned from this book, that being really intentional about results and sharing data is oftentimes difficult across partnerships. And finally, the work is really focused on both expanding access and increasing mobility. And so we also understand in that, you know, there are things that students need that are beyond just the cost of tuition. There are things that people need in workforce programs that are beyond just the opportunity cost of the time that they're not in that job. And so there's a lot of conversation now about how do we de-risk the cost for a job seeker, that is your time away from work, the resources you need to complete that program, and really think about that, making sure that you have access to those educational and skills training programs that could provide you that upward mobility and that upward pathway. So a lot of this is about risk and reallocating risk. But it's also about rethinking how we do workforce development and how we connect people. So of course, I'm going to talk about the chapter that I helped write, but also because it's a pilot project, I'm really proud to have been a part of. And there's a lot of lessons learned that I think will be beneficial, and I hope you'll share in the questions and answers. So I helped contribute to a chapter called Rewiring Workforce Partnerships, which is really focused on an innovation that we tried to help put together here in Philadelphia. And this is co-authored with one of my colleagues from Philadelphia Works, which is our local workforce board and was one of the partners on this project. So to give you some context, I want to step back and say, you know, this book focuses on all types of innovations. Some of them are government-led, some of them are educational institutions, and some of them are about the private sector. And this one is really about how do we increase communication and also risk and investment between the private and the public sector. So I'll give some context here for why that question was really kind of burning in my mind. For my years of work in workforce development, we spend a lot of time talking about the supply side of the problem, right? We talk about workers, we talk about job seekers, we talk about skills, soft skills, hard skills, what skills do they need? But we don't spend as much time talking about the demand side. And while we may know what employers want, or be trying to know what employers want, we also don't think about what the employers invest and what they give into that system. And to make this actually a full and whole picture that increases economic mobility, we have to both be aligning supply and demand and thinking about that advancement, that upward mobility and opportunity. And so the question we asked when we started this pilot and we started this project was, how do we build these real partnerships that leverage employer investment and also ensure the best gain for workers? So what we see oftentimes when we talk about employer investment is that employers are often invested through charity or philanthropy, which is not to say that that's a bad thing. It's actually something we deeply believe in and think is excellent. But when we think about where the gains are, oftentimes those charitable dollars are not going into programs that are providing a gain to that employer. And so one of the questions is, how do we think about the other dollars that are not being utilized here? Where do the human resources dollars go? How are employers invested or not invested in workforce systems? But also, are they getting the best gain for their workers? Are they getting workers who are actually, meeting the needs that they have? Are they creating these feedback loops with the training providers where they say, hey, that program didn't actually give me what I needed. Can you adjust and make sure that the students are also getting these skills? So this is really a question we've been struggling with, is how do we get employers more invested beyond just the time and the energy, right? Dan, they sit on your board, right? Lots of employers sit on workforce boards and talk about the problems with labor shortages and workforce solutions, but aren't necessarily invested in both hiring and advancing those workers. And so this is the question we were asking with this pilot. So to understand that, we had to have some deep conversations, and we brought on Social Finance, which again is a phenomenal organization. If you're looking at some of these innovative pilots, they've done great work across the country. And they helped us to try to understand what drives an employer's value. And what we found really interesting about this is a lot of our assumptions in workforce development are based on the hiring event, right? I have a job, I need to fill that job. Well, what does an employer pay for? They pay for recruiting. Maybe they send a recruiter around the country to interview people. They pay for, the opportunity cost of the revenue when that job is not filled, right? But when you have a turnover event and an employee leaves, it actually costs the employer a lot more. It is the separation from the job. It is then in turn recruiting and onboarding again, decreased productivity, overtime, revenue opportunity costs. And so what we learned from this is that employee retention was actually the greatest risk for employers, that they were really thinking about how do we invest in our workforce to ensure that we are not having these turnover events, to ensure that we are not just bringing people on, but we are bringing on the right people who will stay and grow within our company. And that decreasing the time it takes to fill a position and decreasing onboarding time are also things that are cost saving to employers. And so that kind of drives at, well, how do you make the benefit, the ROI benefit, to partnering better with the workforce system? So we went through a series of complicated questions, and I acknowledge that this slide is a little messy, so bear with me here, because this is where it gets a bit technical. So the first question was, are employers willing to pay for services directly, or do they require a transfer of risk? And what I mean by that is, if you have an employer in your region, would they just pay the workforce board to provide them training? If yes, that's great. They should just do that. And that we don't need a model like this to try to innovate around risk. But in many cases, the answer is no. And oftentimes what we learned from some qualitative research we did is that the answer is no, because of that risk of bringing on the wrong person, right? Because of that risk of, if I bring someone in and it doesn't work out, I'd much rather bring on a temp agency or a temp employee than hire someone who is a bad fit, because it costs me more in the long run. And so we thought about, all right, well, who takes that risk? Is the risk training providers, or is that risk funders? And now if the risk is training providers, we looked at some different types of solutions. And these are all some things that are highlighted in the book. These are all different innovative examples of how other programs have worked. There are performance-based contracts. There's something called an outcomes rate card. That's an example they've done in Massachusetts that's really innovative. And the one we're doing is kind of more like a prevention fund. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is. These are actually not such important titles to know, as much as to know is there are multiple ways to think about allocating risk between the private and public sector. And it really matters what's happening in your economy, who the employer is, who the training providers are, and who has the funding and is willing to kind of try something new. I'll be honest and say one of the things we learned from this is that simple is better. As complicated as that last chart was, this is where we landed. which is a really very basic outcomes-based financing pilot. And where we said, who is willing to take the funding risk upfront? To then say, if we are successful at training someone for this job, an employer will then pay a return to that fund. And so oftentimes those are philanthropic investments, right? We see that a lot. Rockefeller Foundation has done some investments like that. That's highlighted in one of the chapters in the book. There are some investments that are government-led, where the government takes the risk money, and if it works really well, government gets paid back, right? But again, in this question, we wanted to kind of ask, how do we get employers invested? How do we get employers to be willing to take this risk? So we presented this idea in 2018, I believe. Maybe it was even, yes, it was 2018, to some of our board members at the Philly Fed. And there was interest in, how can we actually make this happen? And so the first interest came from Philadelphia Works, which is our local workforce board. They basically said, we have some of this money through pay for success financing, about 4%, that we can allocate for some of these outcomes-based funding models. And so we want to try this. And if you read the chapter in the book, one of the reasons they wanted to try this is because, generally speaking, they don't get paid back, right? So folks like Dan are spending that money and trying to make sure they're meeting the needs of employers and are often not reimbursed for any of those efforts. And so our workforce board said, we want to give this a shot. We want to try this outcomes-based funding pilot, even though we know it is going to cost us time and energy and staffing. We want to try something different to see if we can make that return on investment case to an employer. And the employer who came on board to work with us was Comcast. And again, a very large employer based in Philadelphia. They already do have a significant chunk of their human resources dollars that go towards onboarding and recruiting and temp staffing. And so what was really exciting about this model is that it wasn't their philanthropic dollars, but that it was actually their human resources department that said, we're going to think about how we work with the public workforce board, almost like we would with a staffing agency. And so this was a really interesting process for us to walk through. The pilot was something we learned quite a bit from. I'll share a lot more, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. Pilot has technically signed a contract, but not launched because the jobs were unfortunately in person. And so none of the jobs are currently functioning in the COVID economy. But we also learned a lot about how the private sector and the public sector communicate or don't communicate. And so one of the things that we took away when Tyrone and I looked at this is some of this is really about great relationships. The reason why Comcast and Philadelphia Works were so excited to work together is because they had been working together for a really long time. And so that risk of funding was something they were a little bit more comfortable with because they were already on the board, they were already participating, they already trusted the other person, right? And that is something that we often can't measure in these kinds of projects. We also learned a lot about finding employers who understand the workforce development system and understand what they could get in terms of partnership and what they could get in terms of customized training. And the final thing we kind of talk about here is this innovation window. For every one of the things in these chapters, every innovation, whether it is state-led or private sector-led, there is something that has happened to catalyze this moment. One of my very favorite chapters is actually about a Texas State Technical College. And it's a really interesting example of how a technical college decided to shift its entire funding mechanism to fund outcomes rather than outputs. And they talk about it a lot. It involved a culture change in how they do their work. It involved a culture change in how their staff thinks about their work. And it even made them re-examine their program. They have an example they talk about where there was a 2-year program that they realized the students weren't making much more in the 2 years than the 1 year. And so if you're getting paid for the outcome and not for the person sitting in seats, right, then you actually might want to reduce the amount of time that person's in that program if they get the most output after the 1 year. So that's actually one of the episodes that's covered in the podcast. It's a fascinating example. But it existed because these things came together. We had a shared idea of a problem, right? We knew there was a critical issue that needed to be addressed. So in the case that I've talked about with Philadelphia Works and Comcast, that shared problem was concerns around the labor shortage, around inclusivity, and honestly around building a better future of work for the city of Philadelphia. We also had a target population. We knew that there were a large number of job seekers who had some degree of skill, but needed an additional upskill, right? So maybe you've worked in an administrative role and you could potentially be great in a technical role at Comcast, but you need those technical skills to be able to enter into that role. And so we knew there was a population that we wanted to focus on. And then we knew that there were evidence-based interventions, that there are examples of training providers who are doing really targeted, innovative, and specific training for those employers. And we often call that customized training. And we knew that that kind of an innovation could plug in really well with that target population and help meet that. But the other thing that really fits here in this innovation window is a shared commitment to the problem. At the end of the day, this was a difficult project to put together. And what we learned through this is that because the two institutions, Comcast and Philadelphia Works, were really committed to helping the city of Philadelphia and helping the region, we were able to keep the process moving. And that is oftentimes what it takes to make innovation happen, right? These are really complex systems. People have certain ways they have always done their work, even from like contracting, right? And so it was really exciting for us to see how the private sector and public sector were starting to communicate differently about risk, about paying for outcomes versus outputs. The pilot project that they have outlined is essentially that Philadelphia Works pays upfront for the training. If someone is hired, Comcast pays 40% back at the point of hire and 60% back at the point of retention. I believe the retention marker is 6 months. And so again, this is a way that, Philadelphia Works is actually getting some money paid back for a project they never would have been paid back for historically. They're building a new type of partnership. They're able to advertise to their job seekers a new program that they would not have had. And Comcast is potentially getting a new pool of talent that they may have never accessed if but for this kind of a program. And so the goal here is really to bring those parties together and think about how do you address that nexus of risk, innovation, and make sure that everybody is getting what they want out of an innovative project. I will conclude with just a couple things that I think are really exciting about Workforce Realigned. And again, this is one chapter I'm talking about. There's so much rich and incredible content in this book. But one of the things we see across the board about innovation is that it requires cross-sector collaborations and sharing data, right? And that's tough. Comcast is like, well, I don't know if I want to share that data, right? And that is really what we're here to do, is try to find out, how do we share data? How do we share information? There's a really incredible example of an organization called First Step Staffing that's working with San Bernardino County, and they're sharing information with each other in ways that a staffing agency and a county have never done before, right? And that's really critical to that innovation moving forward. There's also that alignment around surrounding goals and outcomes, right? What are the real outcomes we're driving towards? How do we make sure we're actually getting the students and the job seekers to those outcomes and not just into the outputs? Again, that risk allocation that protects the interests of all parties. There are folks we worked with at Social Finance who are experts at contracts, but also really thinking about who holds risk. One of the things that is talked about a lot in the chapters are career impact bonds, and it's something I'm very excited about. And it is a way of reducing risk to students through a kind of modified income share agreement. So the student is saying, I know I'm not going to pay as much upfront, but if I get this job, I'm going to then pay back the cost of that training. And so there's some really interesting innovations that are happening there to assure students that they're actually going to be getting the outcome that they're paying for. And then finally, an ongoing focus on results, right? That is both for workers, for the employers, and for the economy. And again, these are complex and interesting projects, but they're also exciting examples of how people are really reimagining. We're thinking differently about the bottom line to the triple bottom line. And so for me, this book was something that was such a privilege to get to work on. If any of you have had a chance to look at it or want to ask questions about other chapters I didn't get to talk about, I'm happy to dig in. But I encourage you to go check out the podcast, check out the chapter. And I'm happy to share more about how we think about bringing these innovations to other regions around the country. So thank you so much for the time, and I'm happy to turn it over now. I guess I'm turning over to Dave.
Ashley, thank you. Boy, lots to think about there. That's really good. I have some questions. We've got a couple questions that have come in. We'll save those for when we get done with Dan. But Dan, let's see if we can get your PowerPoint up and have you guys talk.
Hey, Dave, we'll give it a shot here. Can you see my slide?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Well, first of all, Ashley, thank you for what a terrific, fast-paced, full, thought-provoking, and timely presentation. Really gets the juices flowing for everybody on the call. So that was terrific. We got a little different perspective than the kind of high-level overview you saw from Ashley, who's looking at best practices across the country. We at the Berks County Workforce Development Board, even with all of the changes as increases in remote work, at this point in our history, labor markets are still regional. And in Berks County, they're even more local. So 3 out of 5 folks in the workforce both live and work in Berks County, which is, when you think of being part of this greater Southeast PA region that we're lucky to be part of, the fact that more than 3 out of 5 are still living and working here tells you that we have our own unique opportunities and challenges. And one of the things that we want to share at the board is right here in Berks County, great career opportunities, especially in our key industry sectors of manufacturing, healthcare, construction, have never been greater. And most of those sectors and those opportunity occupations don't require a 4-year degree to get started. So we think this is reflected in our brand newly published 4-year local workforce development plan that the board developed over the last 12 months. And that's kind of what we're going to focus some of our comments on here today. So I'm going to start with a kind of an overview of some of these opportunities here that we see for the next 4 years. Then I'm going to turn it over to our board chairperson, Christy Gage Linderman, who's going to bring you the employer perspective on these strategies and what Christy's seeing on the ground. So I'm going to advance my slide here, if it will allow me. And I'm hoping now we're looking at a graph, Dave. Can everybody see that?
Yep,
So,
we can. Yep.
Ashley, thanks so much, because you started kind of at this 10 years ago. I've been at it to see a couple more of the cycles, but really for understand what's going on here currently in Berks County, the slide that we have in our plan goes back to that last recovery from that terrible recession we went through back in 2009. And from 2009 up through January 2020, basically here, just prior to the arrival of the pandemic, we're showing you the annual unemployment rates of the Reading MSA in blue. Reading MSA, the Metropolitan Statistical Area, is Berks County. So we do have an advantage being our own MSA. We can actually access this data pretty readily, and comparing it to similar trends in Pennsylvania and then national. And then the right-hand side of the right-hand side of the graph, we actually change the frequency of those data points, starting with that huge jump in March 2020. They're monthly through the end of December 2020. So, we're calling this recovery 2.0 because that last one was quite long. One of the things I will point out here is you can see as quickly as the unemployment rate jumped up in March and April of last year, it very quickly began a fairly steep return to something that looked a little bit more like normal. So 6.4% unemployment rate at the end of 2020 didn't feel a lot like normal, but I should share, in that last recession, this area was over 6.4% for 5 years. So we went from 2009 to the end of 2014, or I'm sorry, end of 2008 to the end of 2013, where the unemployment rate in the area was higher than we ended last year. Okay, so even again, to go back to a different time, 10 years before, in December 2002, we had the post 9/11 recession. We were up above 6.4% for a number of months there. Interestingly, the recovery of the labor market this time looks a lot more like 2002, 2003 than it did that long, slow slog back from 2009. So, and even though this one looks a little bit like what we saw 2000, 2003, the reality is we've never seen anything like this one before. So let's talk about what happened then as we did make it to 2021 somehow. And then what we saw really in the first 6 months of 2021 was a measured gradual improvement in our local labor market, where we might have been a little bit behind Pennsylvania as a whole as we began 2021, but by June it was clear that we had a much stronger labor market than the Commonwealth as a whole. You can see it more like what the US as a whole was seeing. So we were down to 6.2% in June. We tracked both non-farm jobs and employment. In both cases, we are hovering about 91% of pre-pandemic levels. So that's a big drop still. The number of unemployed residents remained stubbornly high in June at a 12,700 number. That's about 25% of where we were before we went into the pandemic. But the really striking information is at the same time we had thousands of unfilled job openings. So we had more unfilled job openings than we had unemployed workers by June. And that's pretty consistent with the country as a whole. So since we're talking labor market, supply and demand, right? If what we saw last year was last summer it began, the demand for workers very dramatically outpaced the available supply of workers that were willing to re-enter the market. So first of all, everybody got called back to their old jobs that were getting called back largely. Then there were a lot of people who were disrupted, not going back or didn't want to go back to their industry, but they were very slow to get pulled back in. And we saw something that happens in labor markets, but we've never seen it this dramatically, is hourly wages jump dramatically. We saw in the manufacturing sectors, employers increasing wages last summer and fall, $3, $4 an hour for entry-level positions, $5 an hour from what they had done pre-pandemic, which was a fairly tight labor market. But then it just continued. I mean, it was not just a one-time shot. We've seen these continuing hourly wage increases. And when you see that, you're also going to get, we like to track average weekly wages. And here's one that will just make your eyes pop. Between the end of 2019, prior to the pandemic, and the end of 2020, average weekly wages in our MSA increased over 13%. Okay, so that takes a little explanation because remember, it's an average. So if there's a lot of low wage workers who haven't returned, they're not going to factor in and pull down that average. But what we really think has happened here when we look at this, and this year is going to tell us a lot more as we watch average weekly wages, is I'm going to move you to the next slide here. How you like that one, Ashley? I mean, and this is Federal Reserve intellectual property we're borrowing here, but I think I'm citing it properly. But you can see that's a graph of what's happened quarter over quarter, going back to 2016. That thin bar there is the actual recession in the economy. And you can see normally when you have a recession, wages do not spike until a recovery is well underway. But the average weekly wages just went through the roof in 2017. So that's probably a function of three factors in particular. The first one is, as we mentioned before, clearly higher hourly wages for those who were working. Secondly, those who were working were probably getting more hours than they had previously on average. And then finally, I think the downside of this, it's showing the devastating effect on many local residents who are marginally attached to the workforce in part-time, inconsistent employment, and industry sectors that sponsor that kind of employment. So this gets to what Ashley was saying about some definite inequities here. You know, for those that kept working financially, they on the whole have done very well. And some of this is kind of a late reaction to the tight labor market that preceded the pandemic. I don't think employers and workers necessarily understood how much leverage the workers had, but the pandemic brought all that in one fell swoop to a very changed understanding of who had negotiating power regarding their current employers or even new employers. So that's, we're going to keep tracking that, and happy to take any questions on when we get to that. But that leads us to, when we look at this recession, and it's hard to not look beyond it, and I mean the pandemic, but what we found is the pandemic appears to have simply accelerated and exacerbated long-term trends that we had identified prior to the recession. So if you look at some of these trends and challenges and opportunities, they're really not necessarily different than what they were 2 years ago. They're just a lot more intense. So Christy's going to talk about these a little bit, but just real quickly, you know, you never escape a presentation from the board without the Silver Tsunami slide on the aging population in the workforce. So we're going to touch on that briefly. The workforce is obviously diversifying a good bit. The census numbers just came out from 2020, which really reinforced this issue. We have large numbers of young adults who were not well connected to the workforce before the pandemic. That number may have doubled. And when it comes to education attainment, we have a little bit of a mismatch between what our local economy needs and what young people in particular are pursuing. So we're going to be refocused a lot on the value of associate's degrees and industry recognized credentials. And then a real emerging issue is just because you have the jobs doesn't mean that people are going to necessarily get those jobs. And we have a lot of challenges here with adult numeracy and English language learning. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Christy, who's going to talk a little bit about what these challenges look like to our employers, and some strategies that the board has developed in working with employers over the next 2 to 4 years. So Christy.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks, everybody. I'm going to let you continue to navigate the slides, and I'm excited to be here today wearing both my employer hat and my chair hat. So I'm happy to, share additional information too, based on what I'm seeing boots on the ground. But of course, this brings us to the hot topic of the Silver Tsunami, and that is something that Dan's been talking about for quite some time. And of course, as he just mentioned, it is being exacerbated by what's going on with the uncertainties in the environment. We are in unprecedented times, and employers are doing everything they can to navigate this market, but it does not stop what's happening facing the wave of experienced older workers that are exiting the workforce. And that's actually at a pace, if you look at the purple line on the graph, between 2010 and 2030, the potential retiree population is projected to grow by 63%, which takes us from just under 60,000 individuals to 98,000, which as a proportion for our Berks County population, potential retirees are growing specifically 14.5% to 22.6%, which is really reflecting more than 1 out of every 5 Berks County residents heading towards retirement by 2030. With that, it's also important to note that many companies are starting to see this happen more quickly. Many individuals, with the uncertainties, are beginning to exit the workforce a little bit more quickly than anticipated. And as we all know, employers are struggling to refill those positions, and everyone's trying to figure out what they can do to create that stronger pipeline. So you'll notice here with the red line on the graph, that's a relatively flat rate, as we can see, and that is reflecting the potential entrance into the workforce, primarily age 25 to 29, which is really only reflecting a possible increase of 6.7% over 2 decades, up to only 24,961 individuals, trying to replace that 98,000 that we just referenced. So there's definitely a gap, and it's been on our radar for quite some time. I am excited to see that some employers are taking the steps to find ways to navigate this, and it really takes a lot of creativity. there have been so many great ideas that have been shared and so many collaborations that we can certainly get into a little bit later. With this, bringing up our 4-year strategies, the Workforce Development Board recently did adopt this 4-year plan, and there are several strategies. All have been discussed at length and are being shared throughout our community with different organizations, employers in general. I think it's important to especially focus on the engaging with employers in talent retention and development. All these key strategies, of course, collaboration, creativity, planning ahead. These employers are needing to invest heavily in the retention and development of their workforce itself in order to reduce turnover, attract new talent, meet their customer expectations, and find new ways to maintain operations for an overall sustainable business model, especially as we continue to ride the wave of the Silver Tsunami that we've mentioned. Of course, employer innovation is key. And as I mentioned earlier, it is refreshing to see how many local employers are beginning to find ways to connect these dots, being able to adapt and evolve in today's market, engaging our diverse workforce, building stronger cultures and brands, adding new ways of training and upskilling employees, maybe providing education, additional incentives or workplace flexibility, finding new ways to engage the community as a whole and really get that disconnected workforce and the disconnected youth population engaged into these primary sectors that we're focused on, which are manufacturing, healthcare, construction, primarily here in Berks. I'm not certain how many people know, but there are more than 500 manufacturing companies right here in our region, and our goal, all of our goal, is to help them maintain operations, create a more sustainable community as a whole. So with that, when we're talking about how wages are increasing rapidly, I don't know if that part's sustainable, but everything else that the companies are doing to help bridge that gap may be. It's setting us up for long-term success as we navigate all these other barriers and bridges that we're trying to help employers figure out. So needless to say, the employers with the best strategies and focus on talent and culture will thrive, as will their employees, building a more sustainable future for our community and our region as a whole. So I just wanted to touch on those as both chair and employer. Dan, did I miss anything, or is there anything that you'd really like to focus on within these slides that I might not have touched on?
Christy, you nailed it. I would say that, Ashley talked about partnerships, and she does them in tough places like Philadelphia. Just the size of the metro area makes partnering, shame on us here in Berks County if we can't partner faster, quicker, better, because, Dave, what are we, 45 miles east to west, 40 miles north to south, and we have one large, by the way, now the 4th largest municipality in the Commonwealth. Yes. Sorry about that, Erie. But, the ability to do this in real time, see results in real time, really helps us as a board. And so many of the partners that are here on the call, it's kind of a little bit in our DNA, and it's a little bit easier to do here. So again, Christy, I think I'd say shame on us if we don't, connect with the right people to implement these strategies.
Well, thank you, Dan and Christy. Very interesting as well. I'm going to open up the question period here by starting with Christy. Christy and Dan, what do you hear from Ashley that you think is a takeaway you might be able to incorporate into your strategic plan? And Ashley, what counsel would you give them as they start implementing their strategic plan? Are there things in particular you'd try to encourage them or nudge them to consider?
Well, I guess what I'll go, I'm glad to see that Ashley reinforced, the wisdom of my board. About 19 months ago, just ahead of the pandemic, the executive committee of the board looked at how we're approaching workforce here, and how's the board and the career link performing? How are the educational providers and training providers doing? How are the community partners working? And the executive committee, led by Christy, kind of said, well, I think they're all doing what they're supposed to be doing. But as Ashley pointed out, the challenge is, okay, so what's missing? And we did specifically focus on employers who may not have been adapting to the changes that were coming their way as quickly as they would need to. So we actually, we did a study that we unveiled a year ago, focused on best practice, local practices, employer retention and employer development. And just like Ashley said, when you have hundreds of open positions, you're focused on the hiring event, but are you looking at the, exiting event? And are you looking at how you're developing employees in between? So I would say, and Christy, be interested in your thoughts. I think that Ashley just emphasized the study that we produced a year ago, that we need to help employers really focus on that retention and development in a way that we maybe have not had to do in 20 or 25 years. Christy, is that how it looks to you?
Dan, yes, I would echo that exactly. And that was the 2020 employer study. And I think, our team is looking to revisit that and how it may have even changed since the pandemic. But the three key strategies from that were strategy, culture, vision, recruitment and attraction, development and retention. Berks County, Greater Reading as a whole has, I feel, been ahead of the curve with planning, but oftentimes when the employer's backs are up against the wall, they can't make moves quick enough. But the more strategic planning they've got, the more strategic HR teams that they have, those are the employers that we're starting to see break through some of the barriers that we've been facing.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think to Dan and Christy, one of the most important things is the work we talked about, the transactional and uncoordinated versus coordinated, right? And by engaging in this process and bringing your employers together and working collectively to create this plan, you were doing the hard work of trying to coordinate against what are naturally not very coordinated systems. And so I think that's, the exciting thing, and that's really where we see some of the change happen. I think there's lots of conversations happening across the country about job seekers who maybe are, done with working in low wage jobs and are trying to connect to, maybe I've been in retail or I've been in food service, and the pandemic was this moment of awakening where I was like, I don't know if I want to be in this high risk job. And so the hope is, for the data you're sharing, that if you have young people who are disconnected, moving those workers up the economic pathway, then opens those kinds of jobs for young people who have been disconnected. And so I think the hard part is you have to do both the work of the connecting the disconnected and also helping move people along. And I think from my previous work, when I sat with workforce boards, and of course it was Philadelphia and New York City, right, when I was sitting at a board, so much bigger boards and much bigger problems, but there's so much opportunity for innovation at the regional and local level. And I just love what you all are doing in terms of coming together around it. And I encourage you to talk to your boards about, what are the ways they see risk? What are the ways they might want to be invested? Who are the people who, they're not taking on? This conversation about skills versus credentials, and you guys are talking about, the associate's degrees, right? It may be really salient. It may be not so salient in the professions you're working with. So I think that's something I'm seeing boards do across the country is think about, how do we de-risk your investment, right? Like we'll do the customized training. We'll help you get to those skills that you really need, but partner with us. And really partner, not just like in theory and, come to a meeting and tell us that it's not going well, but like really help us work through how we make these programs more responsive to your needs. And honestly, I think I've seen more innovation and success happening in smaller regions and smaller counties. So I have a lot of hope for the work you're doing. And I think you guys are really on the right path. I'm really excited to see it.
And Ashley, to that note too, I'll just mention an article that I had been reading earlier this week about the underutilized workforce that might be in the sectors, civil service or hospitality. How can we retool them, upskill them into, the longstanding stigma that maybe manufacturing isn't glamorous, but there are a lot of fantastic opportunities. How can we begin to transition those individuals into those types of careers as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I see Julia has a question. Am I allowed to call on her, Dave?
Dave, you're on mute. Is it okay for me to ask a question?
I said, because you're her boss, you can do that.
Well, first, Ashley, thank you. On behalf of the board of the the Philadelphia Bank, we're really delighted with the work that you're doing and your outreach to communities like ours. Thank you very much. This is really interesting. I have a question a little bit off the subject. I'm very concerned about the mobility of our lower wage workers, not just in our company, but across our community because of their low vaccination rate. I don't know how much of a generalization that is, but I'm really concerned about illness, about vaccine mandates that are coming, and people really being pushed out of the labor force and out of any real path to mobility. I'm wondering if you have any research or any thoughts that you could share about that.
So we have not looked specifically into the impact of vaccine mandates, and that's not something we've done yet. I do think there are a lot of conversations happening about, like all of the things that have happened in terms of health, who has access to sick time, who has access to, if you are to get sick, right? If you're unvaccinated and you are to get sick, do you have the ability to even take that time off? And so there's been some great research done by some national partners on who can work remotely, who works more in person, who has access to sick time. But some of those are things that you guys are already seeing. Again, we haven't done as much on the health side. I do think there is an interesting conversation happening now about, what will happen to workers if they are falling off in this kind of second wave of what's happening. And Delta variant upticks, and our hope was that the economy is reopening and everything is going great. But there do seem to be some increasing concerns about what that can mean for just our economic growth in general, as well as the workers who may be just recently reattached and might not attach again. And I will say more of our work has actually looked at, even like we have a whole research and action lab on childcare. And when you think about vaccinate, like if someone is especially young people, right, who are at higher risk, who are not even eligible to be vaccinated. And so if your child gets sick and you have a job that doesn't provide you paid sick time, what does that mean for you to actually be able to reconnect to the labor market? So some of the concerns we're hearing now are, we hear from businesses about the labor shortage, and then we're hearing on the flip side that workers are still really hesitant. And so I'm very curious as well how some of these mandates are going to impact people, but also, concerned for the humanity of people, right? that their health is at risk, their kids are at risk. And so that's, I think, a real delicate balance where we are right now. And honestly, lots of workers we're talking to are still careful and trepidatious, and maybe for reasons that, might make sense, might be decisions we might make for our own family. And so again, I don't know much about the vaccination rate, but we have been thinking a lot about access to sick time and who is more likely to actually come face to face with the pandemic because of the work that they do. So happy to, I'll see if I can drop a couple articles in here on some folks. Our colleagues at the Atlanta Fed did some good research on that as well.
Good. Thank you. Ashley, in reading your article in the book, you mentioned that, let me get it right here, that the research showed that a lot of the workforce development money, most of it was going to college educated rather than frontline workers. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that actually, the research showed that employers' funding goes to
Right.
college educated rather than frontline workers. So actually most workforce development money, like money that Dan and the WIOA money spends, goes to entry level and kind of hiring events. And I actually have a slide about this. I don't think I have it there. So we think about this as a pyramid, right? And your workforce funding is kind of right here. It's attaching people who are unattached oftentimes at this point in the pyramid. When you look at employer funding, what we find is that employers tend to spend larger dollar amounts and more funding on manager level training or executive level training, but also just on college educated workers in kind of the writ large. And this is based on a study by the Center for Education and Workforce at Georgetown. And so the question is, who's paying for the middle? Because the workforce board is paying to get people in, and the employers are paying for the people at the top. Who's paying to help people move up between those things? And it's a need you hear on both sides, right? Because for Dan, I'm getting these people in the door. I don't want them to keep coming back into my office. I want them to move up and stay in those careers. And for employers, they're like, I'm losing people. That retention is costing me money. And so I actually think the book, almost all of the pilots are kind of focused on that gap, on whether or not that funding is coming through schools, whether it's coming from the employer, again, the partnership I talked about, it's a little bit of both. It's both the workforce board and the employer thinking differently about how they can put some money into moving those people from that entry level job up the ladder, and hopefully eventually to those manager level jobs. But that is the data that we saw that you're mentioning there is about where employers spend their money on workforce training.
So a big challenge is getting people to think about that being an investment rather than a contribution.
Exactly. And a lot of that work and the lab that we ran and the pilot is really like, how do we make the investment case, right? Because folks who do this work know that you are reducing turnover events and you are providing the kind of unmeasured thing, which are these wraparound supports, right? That person that a job seeker talks to when they are going through a crisis. Those are things we often don't measure. And there's a really interesting pilot in New York City that is, I believe, one of the ones that was Rockefeller founded, where they actually measured the cost of reducing turnover, even in entry-level jobs. They were working with young people who were at risk. They were connecting them to, food service jobs, and they measured the cost of reducing that turnover event. It was almost $3,000 a person, just for reducing the cost of someone leaving, having to hire someone else, bringing someone else back in. So for workforce organizations, they're doing that service. They're actually providing that added value to the economy that we don't often measure because we don't think about wraparound supports in that way. But they're really, really critical to helping people maintain work.
Dave, I might add to what Ashley mentioned here. So first of all, yeah, at the Career Link, 60% or more of the customers we work with on job searches have an identifiable, what we call a barrier to employment. So history of criminal history,
Education, right there.
barriers, educational barriers, right? So because they do need more boost, and a lot of our federal funding is targeted to try to get those people up into those increasingly better entry-level jobs. One of the things about our new legislation, which is the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, the board is allowed to take 20% of our funds and actually do incumbent worker training with employers. And this board, under our executive committee leadership, is all into that, particularly in the manufacturing and construction sectors, because the bang for the buck in training is so great in those sectors. It's a great return on investment. So, the literature says if you invest in people who are already attached to the workforce, you're going to get a better return than if you're trying to make up for 25 years of sort of lost work experience and time in education, right? So we do that strategically. Interestingly, as much as I love my friends in manufacturing, we'll match 50% of the cost of the training for technical training at the Schmidt Center. But that is oftentimes very difficult to get them to invest in those middle skill kind of employees for a couple reasons. We see a lot of manufacturing employers sending their engineers, their managers to all kinds of training. A lot of that has to do with the worker expectation. Those managers and highly skilled individuals know they've got leverage with their employer. If you're not going to help me go get my MBA, or John, and you're in IT in particular, if you're not going to help me learn new skills, I'm going to go somewhere where somebody will, right? And they're much more ready to move. When you get into the more middle level workers, because of, frankly, this is a hangover of the last recession, and here in Berks County, it's a hangover of the last 20 years, they didn't have that kind of mobility. They were happy to have a job. They were happy to have their 4 weeks of vacation. They were happy to stay because those basic needs were being met. I think what we've seen now, and so if I'm an employer, first of all, if they're a key person, can I get them off the floor because I depend on them to help me getting product out? Whereas the engineer, if I send them to training, their project's still going to be when they're there when they get back, right? But for those entry-level people, there's a direct cost if I'm going to take them offline, not just the cost of the training, but the cost of away from the workforce. What we're seeing now, I believe, with the pandemic is workers at all levels are understanding that they have more opportunities to replace what they have with their current employer elsewhere. And so employers that, as Christy said, that are moving ahead are the ones that are kind of figuring out is one, we would need to develop them, but two, if we don't show them interest in developing them to be everything they can be with my company, they're going to go somewhere else. And Christy, I'm wondering if that's kind of what you're seeing, because you're face to face with employers more than anybody on the call.
Yes, we are seeing that every day, and there is not one employer out there that has been untouched by what's going on. Everyone seems to be scratching their heads and trying to put the pieces together. But when we talk about the quit rate being 7 out of 10 employees, it really does help employers take a closer look at, wow, this is really happening right now. And it does not come down to top dollar every single time, but yes, the employers that are creating better opportunities to invest in their employees and show them their future and their path within their company are able to better retain their talent. But yes, it is a huge issue right now for many employers, and everyone still seems to be scrambling to figure it out. And as we mentioned with the wages, I don't know if it's sustainable, but throwing money at the problem is just a short-term solution. It's the bigger picture.
Christy, I was going to say, to Christy's point, we're seeing this with the national employers. One of the advisors for this book was a colleague from Walmart, and Walmart has been really thinking about how do we create career pathways. And so sometimes for workers, it's pay, but it's also knowing where you go next. And so part of the thing we've been talking about is, a quality job opportunity. It isn't just the amount that you make. It is, your experience and belief of your ability to move up in that job. It is, whether or not you're able to take paid sick leave. It is, whether or not you feel like you have agency and choice in your job. And so these are things that some of my colleagues in Boston have been studying. But we found very interesting how many even massive employers are starting to innovate around these career pathways, helping people get access to education, for example, which is something Walmart just invested in, as well as childcare. They realized this was a big issue, and so they made an investment in childcare, which I thought was just fantastic and really innovative. So it is a kind of a crazy moment we're in, but I hope that beyond just throwing money at it, people start to really rethink just what they're doing for their workers at large, and I think that's exciting. That is my hope I see there in a very, very challenging time, right? Yeah.
And I'll just tack on to that. Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to mention too, it's the employers that are innovative when they're hiring on somebody that may not have any experience or skill, but they see that potential in them and giving them a chance. There are still some employers out there that have some antiquated hiring policies or what have you, but it is also time for them to revisit those as well. So I just thought that was important for me to note. Please go ahead.
Ashley, the model you used from Philadelphia, Comcast, was very specific, a company and a provider. Is it possible to translate that to, for instance, what we've been talking about here in Berks County? We have manufacturing employers. Could a whole sector of manufacturing employers do the same sort of thing? Or could, we're a food processing center of the world. We're a battery processing center of the world. We've got some other significant industry clusters here. Could the cluster of an industry do the same sort of thing, do you think?
A great question. And honestly, Dave, it is what we led with when we started exploring this pilot. So what got us to social finance was this idea of almost like an impact investing fund that employers are paying into that does this, that gets this return on investment. I haven't seen a model that is fully launched like that outside of union employment and training funds, which are essentially that, right? They are a covered benefit where right? That's how that works. So we are, kind of trying to design something really similar to that. I am super excited about that idea. And Dan and Christy, if you want to pursue it, I'm like, this is one of the things we're really hoping to do with social finance is try to find where there is energy and excitement around launching these new models. The closest thing I've seen to that has actually been around shared apprenticeship agreements. There's a group, a collaborative, I believe, manufacturing organizations in North Carolina where they are smaller businesses and they can't afford each individually to do their own full registered apprenticeship. And so they are working collectively to actually share, one center for training that is then training people who can meet the needs of all of these businesses. And so that's the real challenge there is like, you would have to have an industry sector that has really shared commitment around outcomes, goals, certifications, and what kind of talent they need. And if that is something you have, again, I'm interested in talking about it. I think social finance would be really interested in talking about it. But it does require, what if I'm invested in this training and you go to my competitor, right? And so that's really what the challenge was when we started looking at this in Philadelphia. We were talking about financial industry and tech industry, and I want to meet my bottom line. I don't care about my competitors' bottom line, right? So the model in theory is really exciting, but it requires those employers to really be collaborative and working together in ways as partners that they see that collective benefit, right? And I think it sounds like Dan and Christy have done a lot of great work just to even build that employer collectiveness. But it is a lot harder once money's on the table.
I would say, Dave, probably where we see the highest level of collaboration and cooperation is really working with our 18 school districts through the Career Ready Berks. You're not quite competing for those students yet, although by the time they're juniors and seniors at either of our career and technical centers, the employers are competing for those that young talent if they fit their needs. I'm a little bit concerned that right now, and I know Christy sees this a lot, the desperate competition for workers makes collaboration right now pretty difficult. Right. And I think that what we've actually seen is even before this pandemic, we saw the highest level of churn of new hires in the Commonwealth was here in Berks County. And that's because of our sector basis, right? So that was happening before. They were already competing. And again, employers, there's never been a lower penalty for quitting your job than there is right now. You know, 5 years ago, you quit your job, you're taking a big risk that you weren't going to get unemployment and you weren't going to get rehired again in 6 months. Right now, what we're starting to see in a couple of sectors, logistics and transportation, manufacturing in particular, I can quit my job and I can find an equivalent job a week or two from now, or Christy is going to place me somewhere else making almost as much, and the employer is not going to ask me why I quit my last job because they don't really want to know.
Yeah. Well, let me follow up on that, Dan. And then I see that Derek Harris has a question he wants to ask, and I'll get to him in a second. But you know, the billboards, you drive along Route 78 and the billboards are there. You know, we'll give you $1,000 bonus. We'll give you 4-day work week. Is there any opportunity to have a conversation with the business? You see it on the BARTA buses where BARTA is hiring. To have this conversation with some of the groups of employers that may be a more strategic way of doing this than throwing $1,000 at an employee you may or may not keep, is to do the types of programs that Ashley has talked about, the types of programs that you're considering.
So real quickly, yes, on a sector basis, not up on 78. They're not cooperating anytime soon, or all the way up to the Lehigh Valley. So probably not in logistics and transportation anytime soon. Where I think we have the most progress already is in the manufacturing sector, where we have an active manufacturing industry partnership that is facilitated by GRCA. It's meeting regularly, and in fact are planning a manufacturing summit at RAC for October 27th. So they're competing, but they're more in a mood, I think, to collaborate because they understand the long-term pipeline issue probably better than other sectors. And I don't even know how to comment about what's going on in the healthcare sector right now. But
yeah, I'm trying to learn that myself. Well, it sounds to me like you have somebody you can invite to the manufacturing summit.
Yeah, we got to get Ashley up here to Berks County because I don't know last time we actually got her to Reading. So,
Derek, quickly.
Sure. One of the things, I'd worked with a lot of employers on wage info and stuff like that. When I would speak and reach out to some of these employers, one of the things I noticed is, as you had mentioned, the large amount of turnover. And one of the things I had asked is like, do you know what it costs for you to hire and train someone? And oftentimes it's a lot. And I'm like, okay, well, if you're having an issue getting people on board, can you look at taking some of that money that you'd be spending on hiring, retraining, advertising for these positions and rolling that into the wages for those employees, so they have a better, you have a better shot of getting them on board in the first place, or using those as, 6-month bonus or something like that. where you don't need to give out the, if it's $5,000 to hire someone, you can give the employee $1,000 bonus. And, it seems like you're paying more money, but in reality, you're saving $4,000. And I think, taking approaches like that, where some of these companies are able to reshift some of that, the funds they're spending on hiring employees to keep with retaining employees, as you had mentioned, Ashley, is like a really an area that places can do a lot better with and grow upon. But a lot of places don't know what they don't know. They don't know how much they're spending on this endless cycle of hiring employees, because they're like, oh, I'm just going to hire them and they'll work here. And it's like, and they leave in 4 weeks, and you're like back to square one. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that's something I had tried to work with some local employees, and some like the idea, others didn't, because it's like, well, I don't want to, pay more up front. It's like, and they try and hire the same person 3 times.
Yeah. I mean, and it's a really interesting example again of like, are they recognizing retention as their highest cost? But one of the things we talked about a lot with these partnerships is also workforce organizations and people who are funded by, Dan or other philanthropic organizations are assets that exist that are already doing this, right? And they actually can be a risk reduction if you partner with them really intensely. And that goes both ways, right? Also, workforce organizations need to like make sure they're meeting the needs of the employer. If you're just sending them people who aren't a good fit, it doesn't actually work for the employer, and it's actually probably higher risk for them. And so one of the things we're really interested in is like that customized training model, right? Like, how do we utilize these assets that exist that are publicly funded and leverage some of those public dollars to mix with those private dollars so that both people are getting a return on investment. And it's not just totally out of pocket for the employer, right? Because we kind of asked that question too, Derek. We were like, why aren't you paying for this already? And what was really interesting to us, both in the quantitative analysis social finance did and our listening sessions with employers, was the perception of risk is really on whether or not they stay. And so it is less risky to bring on a temporary employee. And so it's a lot easier to temp out a job and fill it until you find that, the person you feel like is a really good fit. And so one of the things we've been thinking about is how do we bring workforce organizations in there? Because they're already funded, they're already local, they're already tapping into talents, they're already aware in ways that many employers are not of the skills that people have that maybe aren't really quickly visible on a resume, right? And so that's something one of those problems I'm like, it's a critical systemic problem I'm really interested in solving for, but it requires employers to be aware, and oftentimes they're not, or they're like, oh, there's too many organizations, they just talk to me all the time, I don't know who does what, right? Sure, Dan's heard this. But likewise, that they aren't necessarily quantifying their cost of turnover. And there is, Aspen Institute actually has a calculator for cost of turnover. So when you're having those conversations with employers, if you want to talk about it, they actually have a way you can go through if they aren't measuring it and say, here's actually what it's costing you when you don't retain employees.
Thank you. Well, we're getting close to the end, and I have one obligation for somebody I have to let speak at the end of this, but I want to thank our presenters. It was a great program. For me, it was probably one of the best commercials I've seen in a long time. And here's why. The Berks Alliance was created to be a catalyst for community action to create a more vibrant community. So that's what we're trying to do by doing these events. It is a group of the anchor institutions in Berks County who have come together to think about how they can invest their resources to create that healthier, more vibrant community. So you're making me feel like we were ahead of our time by creating the Berks Alliance when we did it. Number of the topics that we've talked about here today. We talked about the skills-based occupation stuff. We did a forum on that, and it triggered, I think, some discussion in the community, and I think we have to build on that and enhance that some more, but it triggered that conversation. We did a forum on broadband gap and the problems that's caused here in Berks County in particular. And it's led to some significant activity, I think, occurring through the county, the city, and the Why I'm Missing Foundation in particular, focusing on that as an issue. We had Keith come talk about his research, which was very helpful. And I'm going to, in a minute, mention our upcoming community forums, but one of them is going to be on making the case for early childhood education. which Ashley, you mentioned was one of the challenges that people were facing and why we're having trouble attracting them back to the workplace. I'm going to come back in a second, but I want to turn it over to John Weidenhammer, who's the chair of the Berks Alliance.
Thanks, Dave. And I just want to take a minute, Dave, to thank you for putting this very interesting and exciting and informative forum together. So thanks for that. And Ashley, Dan, and Christy, thanks so much for great presentations. I wanted to note that the book that Ashley referenced, The Workforce Realigned, is available at the workforcerealigned.org website. You can download it in its entirety or chapter by chapter, and it's 300 pages. So there's a lot of really super content there. Dan mentioned that in the IT business, we have a need to train our people. And at Weidenhammer, we often say, if we don't train our team members, somebody else will, meaning that they'll go to another place where they can get the training. I also wanted to mention that I'm on the board of the Berks Latino Workforce Development Corp, which is a workforce development organization that's emerging here in Berks County. And if there are employers on the line who have high turnover jobs that they need to try to stream people into, please call me up, because we might be able to develop some programs for helping to train folks to get into those jobs. I also liked, and just wanted to comment on the fact that Ashley talked about sort of turning the model on its head, about rather than paying for buns and seats, paying for outcomes. And I really liked the idea of that, because it really creates a paradigm, a different lens through which we look at the workforce development investment. There's a lot of money flowing into workforce investment, but some of it is not really geared toward getting good outcomes. So again, I know we're up against the time now, but just thanks to everybody. Thanks to the folks that tuned into this. And just on behalf of the Berks Alliance, we think that these community conversations are among the most valuable thing that we do. So we intend to continue them on into the future. And I'll turn it back to Dave, who I think is going to talk about that a little bit. But thanks again, everybody. Really a super event today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you again. It was terrific. I do want to mention that we, as I said at the very beginning, we do host these community forums on the third Thursday of every month. We've gotten even more aggressive. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be doing 3 forums. So we're going to be busy. Next week, August 25th on Wednesday at noontime, we're via Zoom, we're doing a forum. It's a spotlight on the Drexel Medical School. We're going to have the new dean of the new Drexel Medical School talk about that institution, what they're doing, what its hopes are, what its future is. She may bring some other people with her, so hopefully you'll be able to attend that one. On September 16th, we have colleagues of Ashley's coming up from Philadelphia via Zoom again, and representatives from the Berks County IU and from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to talk about making the case for early childhood education, how this is really a 2-generation investment opportunity. It creates an opportunity for the families of the children who get childcare to be able to continue to work. And all the research shows that kids who go through early pre-K programs are much more successful in school, much more socialized, much more likely to pursue education and careers. And then on September 23rd, we're going to have the city of Reading unveil its strategic plan for the downtown core that it's been developing in collaboration with Stantec. And those invitations will be going out shortly. And we're beginning to plan for October and November as well. So hope to see you all then. We have recorded this program. We will share it with everybody. Ashley, if you're okay, we're going to share everybody your PowerPoint so they can be even more inspired. And Dan as well will share yours, and look forward to seeing everybody at a future community forum. Thank you all again.
Thank you.